Welcome back. You're watching Global Today here on Morning Prime. We continue a pace with the conversation. Now we are focusing intently on what is happening in DR Congo with the latest development. As you can see on the front page of East African, there is a Russian question, or not really the Russian question, but the Russian question Congo conflict that we have of this mercenaries, Russian question in Congo conflict. And I'd mentioned that previously, the president of DRC had ruled out bringing in Russian mercenaries to help quell the raging conflict in DRC. However, as per reports, Western diplomats, as I've mentioned earlier, are deeply worried about the sudden appearance of Eastern European mercenaries in the volatile Eastern Congo. Now, despite DRC's denying rumors about Kinshasa hiring the Wagner group abound, and as per the report, since around Christmas of 2022, white military personnel from Eastern Europe have fully booked a hotel located near the international airport of Goma in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And as per the post, we are told that they wear a variety of uniforms with no national flags and holsters that, of course, is bearing the pistols. The presence of the armed Eastern European men in Goma have raised questions and speculations in diplomatic circles, and it has sparked rumors that the government of DRC has hired the Russian mercenaries Wagner group to help fight the rebels in Africa. And there is a growing anti-West sentiment taking hold in many countries. On the other hand, Wagner group is getting more and more ground in Africa, DRC, amid a growing pro-Russian sentiment. Now in Africa, Wagner mercenaries have been hired to help fight Islamist insurgents in Mali and rebels in the Central African Republic. In a latest expression of growing anti-West sentiments in Africa, hundreds have staged a demonstration against France in Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou. And this is what we want to discuss with our panelists with this latest development. First of all, we want to demystify the Wagner mercenaries. Who are they? They appear to be very amorphous and very furtive in their operations. So today we want just to learn from our panelists who the Wagner group is. Let's begin with you, Dr. Kalenja.
Yeah, the Wagner, as they pronounce it, it is a military company, like the Blackwater, the United States. Of course, the Blackwater, we look at it as good, and then the Wagner, we look at it as bad. But there was one time it was very infamous, because of some of the actions they undertook in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, it's been used instrumentally for conflicts in Syria, in other places, the reports that they have a presence in some, parts of Africa and stuff like that. And so it's a mercenary group, and it's not the first mercenary group to have presence in the continent. You have the South African, what is it called, executive outcomes, that was very notorious in lots of coups. And you have a series of military companies from Eastern Europe, from Poland, from the Czech Republic, and stuff like that. Actually, right now as we speak, they've been doing things for good or for bad in a number of countries in assisting, especially countries whose capacities may be limited. Now, Machiavelli warned against using the mercenaries in any conflict because you can't rely on them. They don't have the kind of commitment that patriots tend to have. And sometimes they can change sides very quickly depending on who's going to pay the most. Now, with regard to in the current war in Ukraine, the recent victory in around Bakhmut, apparently they were very heavily involved in actually trying to do that, which means there is a decent working relationship, probably with Moscow to be able to do that. Now, that does not mean that Moscow or Russia is the only country that is using them in conflict. As mentioned, the U.S. has used, these military companies in theaters of war to save American soldiers' lives, for instance. And these people are also trained. A lot of them are also ex-military. Others they train in military combat and stuff like that. So they're not completely new. Now, states use these because, it can create what we call plausible deniability. You can deny you're not involved, and it's just a military company. What business do you have to do with it? Whatever they decide they're going to do it. And if they want to help you, well and good. If they don't want to help you, well and good. Now, with regard to the Congo, Is it a Wagner group? We do not know that yet. So I think let's not, jump, very quickly to conclude that. And the reason I'm saying this, it is possible it is, or it's also possible it's not. And it's possible it's not, but something related to countries in Eastern Europe, for instance, like Russia, because the jet, the Su-25, is a 40-year-old Soviet, plane that's meant for ground support, support the ground troops in terms of operations as an aviation asset. It was very reliable during the Cold War. It was used extensively in some parts of the world. And these are Russian jets, okay? Of course, Ukraine also had them in the former Soviet space, but right now they may not be the ones who are being involved. But for you to operate this, because Congo didn't wake up one morning and start having those jets, they had to get into some kind of arrangement. And it's a single seat, fighter jet, twin engine, which also requires quite a bit of expertise to be able to run them. Now, to the extent that Congo has acquired them, it means it's going to need personnel to run those jets. Going to need personnel to maintain those jets, And so those people who are present, if they're coming from, in fact, Russia, they could playing both. Number one, to be able to train and assist these guys in not just in running the equipment, but probably sometimes perhaps even conducting some of those operations in cases where perhaps Congo may not, or DRC may not be having sufficient capacity. Remember, this is the first time DRC is trying to actually use people from outside in terms of mercenaries to do this work. Part of it because it's military, and not only is it strained, it also very lacking in terms of equipment and capacity. When you're having determined rebel groups where your own aviation assets are insufficient, where you own technical, because it takes a lot of skill to be able to train someone who can maneuver with a decent fighter jet, or it's just going to be brought down on the first day out. So, to the extent that that is present, because we cannot confirm all of it is speculation, but because of the trend of what has been happening, we can say, well, they come from a certain part of the world. There is a likelihood that they're playing both the role in terms of supporting the government efforts, DRC's own government efforts, and they are not under an obligation to respond to anybody, because Congo is a sovereign country, But at the same time, it could also be the expansion of the Wagner activities, in Central Africa, generally space, to support. Mercenaries don't just, come out of nowhere. It also speaks sometimes to the lack of capacity of both the country as well as the region. Like right now, Kenya is part of the East African Regional Force, trying to do some things in there to ensure that, Kenya is peaceful. And so, to the extent that the government perhaps has become desperate enough to do that, also speaks to its unpreparedness in dealing with the complex problem of rebels. Now, the M23, anyone who has seen them, it's a very, very heavily armed and very well-trained fighting force. It's not something you're just going to go there with any helicopter and they're going to bring it down, So you're actually going to need some very good experience. Now, unfortunately, because our countries sometimes have not built sufficient capacity to do that, we find ourselves, unfortunately, sometimes relying on foreigners, including mercenaries. So I will not be surprised if Wagner is involved.
Well, but what do we say in regard, because this is what the Minister of Foreign Affairs was actually alluding to, that yes, they're in the country to assist with some of, the military gear that they have. We mentioned, of course, the aircraft. Why can't they send some of these firefighters, the pilots, to Russia to be trained? Because now this is sending a very conflicted view. When we're in a warring faction, and we see also mercenaries really coming into the country, we don't know if they're here to assist, to train our military personnel or not. And this is also coming in light of what we had as people had observed, and there was I think a white man. There was messages circulating on Twitter showing a corpse of a white man in a camouflage uniform lying in the dirt. The M23 leadership had confirmed that the white man was killed in the village of Karenga. I think that was on December 30th. So most Congolese really can't tell if the man was from Russia or from Eastern Europe nations. Still, they will always just use that broad brushstroke of Russia and the mercenaries. So even for their own security, if they've come to train and then you find a corpse as well, how would you correlate?
Yeah. Just someone quickly, why can't they send them out there Dibal, you don't train how to bomb rebels in Congo forest in Siberia. Okay. So, Siberia is one very good practice, to be able to do that. You have to actually do it in the Congo. Now, this is a common practice. Right now you have mercenaries in Ukraine from both sides, from both sides. There are those who are offering technical capacity, but because the governments are sponsoring them, they can actually deny that they don't have boots on the ground, but they actually do have boots on the ground, you see. You can simply deny. So it's just better, for instance, to train them in using that equipment while you're still there. In real actual environment, you allow them, give them coordinates and stuff like that to make them a lot more effective. In war situation, this has happened. And so we're acting all surprised in East Africa, a lot of times just because we don't have sufficient understanding of actual international relations, international politics. But this is something that happens every day and still going on, and I expect it's going to happen. I think the question for Kenya and East Africa is what impact is it going to have on our peace missions, especially as a region inside the Congo? And is it going to make relations between, for instance, Rwanda and Congo worse to the extent where it becomes unsolvable? Is it going to create other problems that perhaps are unintended in ways that is going perhaps to drag the region into another conflict that is going to take perhaps even longer than Somalia? And that is, I think, the question we should be asking.
Right. Let's hear from you, Muhito.
So 2 quick observations. The first, of course, is that this revelation that is now in the public domain happens at the time when the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs is traveling in Africa. And I think, it's important that the Foreign Affairs Minister addresses himself to this issue. Under international law, mercenaries are prohibited. So it may be normal, but it actually is not a norm in the sense of an international practice. So it's actually, I wouldn't say it's illegal because that may be going too far, but I think the important thing about mercenaries is that they blur the lines between, civilians, military operations, and peacekeepers. Like, who are they accountable to? Who's responsible from a command responsibility for the actions of, the ones that we've mentioned, the executive outcomes, the Wagner group, the Blackwater, the Dike was the other one that was heavily, white Zimbabwean or Rhodesian influence. So it is a violation of human rights and humanitarian law. And what we've seen mercenaries essentially be used in conflict situations. And Hassan, I think, has spoken about a few places, but let's also remember places like Mozambique, where yes. The Dike company was actually responsible for bombing civilians in villages as a combatant, action. And places like Syria, you've mentioned Equatorial Guinea, Zimbabwe, Central African Republic, all the places where you see failed states, or there have been, states that have been challenged, have, been really playgrounds for mercenaries. So we have to condemn this and denounce this practice, and also ask governments to disassociate themselves from this.
Right. Peter Kagonja.
Well, I think you need to put Wagner into context in terms of what is happening now. First, we've seen the return of the Cold War.
Yes.
So we are now talking about the second phase of the Cold War. And the return of the Cold War is now clearly defined in terms of its goals and so on. And you just need to read the U.S. national security strategy to find what Biden thinks he's doing. It's very different from what Trump was doing. Trump was basically more roguish, but Biden is a little bit more responsible in terms of saying that we want kind of responsible competition. But what tools are now being used? And the U.S. has defined the 2 enemies. One is Russia, the other one is China. In categorization, China is a greater enemy than Russia. And therefore, for the West, whether it's European Union or the Washington, Russia's presence in Africa and elsewhere is of a nuisance value, because it is really, harboring the interests of the West, when in essence it cannot win a geostrategic war. This is the argument. China can. It has the military, it has the resources, it has the technology, it has everything. That's according to the national security strategy. So the new game, the new war is between the West and China. Now, Wagner and others are just instruments that are now being used in this new Cold War. Remember, you're doing it at a very, very sharp scrutiny of the Irongos of this world, the Amnesty Internationals and others. So you need to go under. If you can just remember what happened immediately much of Africa returned to democracy, and what the regimes of the time did in order to suppress democracy, stay in power, while at the same time, escaping the scrutiny of human rights organizations. They started so-called the informal repression, where you find ethnic militias and the communal fighting. That's why we had the so-called ethnic clashes in the Rift Valley. In Sudan, there were the Janjaweeds. In other parts of in Sierra Leone, there were the Jongs and all that. And Mai Mais in Eastern Congo. Now, from a Western perspective, from a European perspective, whether Eastern Europe or Western Europe, mercenaries are the equivalents of the Janjaweeds. Yeah. And they are using them almost in areas which are volatile. There was an argument, and I think we need to pursue it with my brother Hanenje, that terrorism is used basically instrumentally to assert the powers of certain, interests. So when you see, Al-Qaeda, then you see Al-Shabaab and others, they are actually championing interests of certain powers. They're not just rogues that are fighting for Islam or for this. After all, Islam is not about war, it's about peace. Why are they in war? Why? They are mercenaries that are being used for a certain purpose in Islamic world. And it is this concept that Wagner rises. There is no denying it. This is the most powerful strategy that Russia has ever invented in terms of asserting itself in Africa. They're in Mali, they're in Central African Republic. In fact, statues are being erected in their honor, protecting women and protecting children in such countries. They are they're in Mozambique. Everywhere there is volatility, and Russian interests is endangered in terms of access to gold, to other strategic minerals and so on. The Wagner group will be there. Just like the executive outcomes will be in Sierra Leone and everywhere else, asserting the British and South African interest. And I think for us as Africans, we need to say no to mercenaries, whether they are from East or West. Our cry is, leave us alone.
So how do we define mercenaries from terrorists? Because what gives them the mandate to actually be in Congo or whichever country? And here we are raising accusatory fingers to Al-Shabaab and other factions and this, the IS as well.
It's a doublespeak. That's what I'm saying. It's doublespeak because if you look at the Al-Shabaab, whether you want to agree with it or not, Al-Shabaab was part of the proxy wars in the Horn, particularly in the post-Ethiopia-Eritrea war. And Al-Shabaab becomes a factor after the Eritrea-Ethiopian war. And therefore, Al-Shabaab grew as a proxy force. Whatever else it became and the threats it caused, those are secondary issues. The primary issue is that Al-Shabaab was born out of the proxy war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Now, and the same thing with ISIS. Yes, ISIS is born out of the conflict. There's a proxy force in Iraq-Syrian war. And so on. And therefore, Wagner is born in Syria, grows strong in Syria in order to deal with the American support of other forces. And therefore, these both terrorists, as we know them, and mercenary groups, as they're now being defined, are a part and parcel of complex proxy wars.
Okay. Let's hear from Hamid Hashim.
Well, everything has context. And one of the things that we provide is a bit of context to these things so that people can understand from what landscape and from what historicism that these kinds of groups emerge from. Because, without a context, it becomes befuddling for you to understand them. So if I could just put my 2 cents on this thing. The great Deval Aimé Césaire, who wrote a book called Return to My Native Land, who's the father of Afrocentrism. said that God's pencil also has an eraser. God writes these events, but he also has an eraser. He can. My point here is, about in 1960, here in Lake Tanganyika, a man called Che Guevara and about 12 Cubans landed there, crossed into Congo, and met Kabila, who was the former president who died in Zaire, it was then called Zaire, in which they were going to fight back against the overthrow of Patrice Lumumba and his macabre killing. That front collapsed because there was the organization that was being brought there was confronted by mercenaries. So it is the French, the Americans, and the Belgians hired mercenaries because the Congolese army, was not professional at all. In fact, it rioted and mutinied at independence. So the birth of mercenaries, is from the world's intelligence organizations. So to fight Che Guevara and the Popular Front for Congo, the three countries created mercenaries. That's the first thing that has happened. Again, in Angola, when the late Fidel Castro sent hundreds of thousands of troops with Soviet equipment. Just before while there was fighting, the MPLA was trying to get independence for Angola. It is the Americans, who brought in French mercenaries. These are historical facts, we're trying to get some, pedagogy going on with our university students so they know that there's a context to everything. So these groups were brought into this region because of national self-determination, because the Africans had risen up and they wanted to get a freedom. So people like Roberto Holden and the Jonas Savimbi were given South African mercenaries, And it is the Cuban troops that helped liberate Angola, and of course went to Lisbon in Portugal, where Namibia got its independence, and ultimately South Africa. So mercenaries, are a product of international states, international intelligence organizations, and they are used, and up to today in the Congo, as you just postulated, that Congo wants to get mercenary troops. This is from a historical point of view because they remember how the wars were and the skirmishes were fought for gain in the Congo. So, the context of these mercenaries and where they've emerged from is thusly so. I put it to you then, then what is the issue that, from a point of view of political economy, that we have to understand? The question of the Congo is the same question in Kenya. It's about who belongs and who does not belong. My colleague, my learned colleague there, Dr. Hassan, has said to us before that the people of Eastern Congo are citizens of the DRC. They are not citizens of Somalia. They did not come by the lake. They did not parachute over there. They are home. And they must be granted citizenship. Now, if the Congolese government tries to play Simon says sit down with the peace agreement that Kenya so ably brokered, you know what's going to happen is that Rwanda is going to invade Eastern Congo again. You know they nearly captured Kinshasa the last time. It is the most organized military force in East Africa today is in Rwanda. The Congo will fall like a piece of cheesecake. And that is why Kenya has got military people there. And that is why the region is committed military there, because we all know how strong Rwanda's disciplined army is. And they are not going to allow their brethren there, because this is the consciousnness of our African leaders. The ethnicity is what is important. It's not the consciousness of trying to build a democratic system of a nation state that's got regional citizenship, as my learned senior on the right has always put to us here. And therefore, I suggest to you that we have to bite the bullet as Africans and say, are we going to continue in this path that for 60 years in this continent has produced nothing? It has produced nothing. What has it produced? It has produced wheat farmers from Manitoba to go to Cameroon, to go and bring peace between British colonized people and German colonized people. If you remember the ball in Cameroon, that Ahmed Ahijo, the late Ahmed Ahijo, Allah yarhamah, who was a regimental sergeant, was a product of the British, and the ball they gave him power in the Cameroon. And the entire problem of the Cameroon is when they gave this soldier, a sergeant in the African Corps there, power. And what did he do? He gave it to another person who's from the Sorbonne. Obviously, Paul Biya did not read anything, did not read Aimé Césaire in the Sorbonne. Of course he didn't. Otherwise, he would not be in Switzerland eating chocolate while his country is being reconciled by people from Manitoba. At the end of the day, the ball, I put it to you that it is very important for us to tell the truth about the history of this continent, to give it context, and to point to a direction where we can all be redeemed.
All right. Because also Dr. Kanenje addressed the issue of speculation where this, we're not really sure if they are Wagner on the ground or not. I think also I'm getting some information from my director, Okedi, here, saying that Congo's government also recently explained why it does not need to hire Wagner's mercenaries. And this was a statement from Patrick Mokar, the communications minister, saying that if we get Sukhoi aircraft that you've mentioned here, and we saw Sukhoi was also shot at by the Rwandese. We'll talk about that later. We need technical personnel to maintain them. If we don't have the manpower, what do we do? He asks. He said that the military should be trained with existing resources. Also, he mentioned former members of the French Legion as an example. In, I think, May last year, Defense Minister Kabanda watched a flight demonstration of Sukhoi jets at the Congolese Air Force airfield in Kinshasa. On the tarmac, there were Eastern European men in uniforms with the insignia of the private Bulgaria company, Ajamira. Kabanda praised them for having repaired all combat helicopters in only 57 days. And UN investigators have confirmed that Ajamira had stationed some 40 engineers and flight technicians at the airport in Goma to carry out repairs. Among them were Bulgarians, Georgians, and Belarusians who were familiar with Russian aircraft. In addition, Congo Air Force employs Georgian pilots to fly fighter jets. So the Ajamira, the Wagner, we cannot really tell. Let's just wind up on that particular note. And what is the way forward right now? And with the latest development, we've seen also the Rwandan Air Force, shooting at the DRC Sukhoi aircraft. Dr. Kanenje.
Well, of course, then any hostile action is an act of escalation, But as I mentioned, that it could be anything that was based on speculation, and I think is being confirmed, including by United Nations, because it's true. Eastern Europeans are more familiar with Russian aircraft, and they could be coming from any of those countries. Now, that's not to deny that maybe the government may not perhaps be tempted to do that, but I think by trying to bring down Sukhoi for violating the Rwandan airspace is an escalation. And I think at a leadership level of the region, these are things that should be discussed. Because next time it will be another flight perhaps being brought down. Now, that violation may have been intentional or may have been unintentional. Part of it, especially when you're not very careful and operating along the border areas, those kind of accidents happen. And anyone who remembers the crisis that was caused by the Turkish shooting down of the Sukhoi 24, that increased tensions between Russia and Turkey. That violation was apparently accidental, but then the impact, of course, was huge. And so I think at a regional level there should be a discussion diplomatically to ensure that those temperatures are at least are reduced or are lowered, because at the extent that this is happening, then any other potential violation, next time it may be a civilian aircraft that is actually being perhaps brought down and not a military aircraft. Now that's going to have consequences for regional diplomacy. And that civilian aircraft may be, carrying Kenyans, may be carrying other people. And so I think this is something the region should discuss at the highest level.
So this is the third time in 3 months. Is it an intentional provocation from DRC?
I'm not in the minds of the DRC decision makers, so I will not be able to.
But from your own perception, do you think happening in 3 months, it
Yes,
can't just be
it's a
accidental?
provocation.
It's a provocation.
They are not going to, they're not, the ink has not even dried on the agreement. And what do they want? You see the Congolese, you remember Andrew Ngumba, remember the mayor of Nairobi? I don't know if you remember Andrew Ngumba. Andrew Ngumba came from the Congo,
Andrew Ngumba.
Yeah, all the people from the Congo look like that. You know, we haven't seen our singers. It's true.
Andrew Ngumba is from my village.
Well, he's from the village, but originally.
I thought.
Yes, but originally. So people didn't fall from the sky.
Did he own a bank?
Yes, Andrew Ngumba, the late Andrew Ngumba was my dad's friend. So I know he used to come to the house. So let me tell you something. That the Congolese, you know, even if you look at the bands, the Congolese, they all look like Andrew Ngumba, the late great Andrew Ngumba. And these people came and stayed here in Mount Kenya. Then there's the other group that came from the Cameroon Mountains, and they settled there. And then there is the Maasai who came from the Sinai, and they all mixed each other up. And we have people like Kagwanja now. Now, the thing about it, is
from Virunga.
Yes, now from Virunga. So the thing about it is, on a light note, let me just
You're giving too much rope.
So you know, my community, we traveled in the 14th century through southern Uganda and through the Great Lakes in eastern Congo. Those are Somalis over there, But you see, after hundreds of years in creation of these so-called nation states, these people belong there just as much as I belong in Kenya. Even though my ancestors came from Ergabo in northern Somalia hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years ago. Now, the issue is we have to understand that the concept of the French Revolution produced something called the citizenship. This citizenship is what the state and the individual have a contract about. These things were imposed on us. Even the flags that we have, the tricolor from the French Revolution, we have to understand that we all belong to this. And Professor Kagwanja brought up a profound issue in the last show, which we all ought to think about, and this is called regional citizenship. And this is how we're going to solve our problem. And I want to put it to you that my learned senior's assertion that our ethnic problems and our citizenship problem can be resolved through a super-regional identity is an answer to our problems. So that we don't say that the Tutsi, the Banyamulenge of Eastern Congo don't belong to Congo, because everybody looks like the late Andrew Ngumba. This is the question that we have to answer. The question of ethnicity and the state and belonging. And if we don't do that, these nation states we're trying to create are going to crumble.
Thank you. Let me just get to also Irungu and ask you, now the effort that we are trying to put forward as an East African community with also boots on the ground here from Kenya, the East African standby forces there as well. The question will be, how does this in a way scuttle the whole process? If there's provocation happening between DRC and Rwanda in 3 months, this is another one, and now Rwanda has to shoot down a Sukhoi.
I mean, obviously, it doesn't help the peace efforts. It doesn't help the, I guess, the reclamation of territorial sovereignty and the ability of the DRC government to govern its territory. It also doesn't help, you know, the restoration of human rights and peace to the communities that are affected by the violence. So it's obviously a terrible turn, I think, in that sense. So I think we have to, again, put more, return the focus primarily on the dialogue that is taking place between the parties, and hope that we will see a breakthrough in the way that we are seeing a breakthrough in Ethiopia.
Okay, let's hear from Kagwanja.
Dibal, across history, down history, we've had you know, certain concepts, Pax Britannica, Pax Romana, Pax Helena, the Greek, and all that. The big question that one asks is, whose peace are we talking about? Whose stability are we talking about? Because every peace and every stability benefits a certain power. And therefore, in Eastern Congo, who is going to benefit from the peace when it returns? That's a big question. And do you really want peace if it is not going to benefit you? These are serious, you know, political questions. Now, if you could just go a step back and look at Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, during the Cold War. There were the Cubans. The Cubans came and basically supported the regimes of the time, and they stood against Western, invasions or Western-sponsored, opposition mercenaries. Whether you're talking about, UNITA, or you're talking about the other one in Mozambique. Now, I said we are in a new Cold War, and in this new Cold War, then there is the effort to ensure that regimes stand against this, and that's where Wagner is coming in look at it almost exclusively, except possibly for Mozambique and Sudan. These are in French African countries, except for Sudan and Mozambique to a great extent. And therefore, there is that element. Then the second element related to that is now Eastern Congo. And the question you ask is whether these mercenaries are going to undermine the work of the East African community. The East African community is going for M23. If these mercenaries go for M23, we're going to have a peace emerging. And it's a peace that benefits the larger picture of the East African community, but obviously is going to be extremely negative for Rwanda and others. So we must look at that in that context, that it is not always that because we don't like the group, the outcome is not going to be likable. I see if the Wagner group, this is contentious, almost controversial, but if the group allies itself with the Congolese government and destroys M23, the loser is going to be Rwanda. It is not the East African community. And I think we need to think about the peace we want in the region. What kind of peace we want in the region? We want a peace that asserts the diplomacy of Congo, but at the same time, supporting, Hashi's relatives in Eastern Congo, that they can be there. We have been there before. Congo is ours. So me and Andrew Goba and others, thanks to your propaganda, but here we are here. So whose power is being asserted by the mercenaries? Whose power did the Cubans assert in Ethiopia? Whose power did they assert in Angola? And whose power is being asserted by the current mercenaries, a wave of mercenaries that are going on now? I think that's a big question. I don't see any conflict between the East African community force and the mercenaries if they are fighting M23. But I see serious trouble for Rwanda, which would want to get a better compromise and a new order.
All right, let's hear from Kanenje. We wind up on it. Then we ask Oscar pivotal questions. There is also the Vatican visit in DRC. What will that really portend? We have also the Archbishop of Canterbury that will be part of that particular delegation.
Yeah, I like what Prof just said, whose peace. One time Nelson Mandela was visiting, I think, a university, must have been Harvard in the United States, and he was challenged by some the hosts, some journalists, about his association with Gaddafi as well as Fidel Castro. And he had a very brilliant answer. He said, well, the problem with you guys is you think that your enemies should necessarily be your enemies, Now, Gaddafi and Castro were always very controversial, especially in the West. And there is a history to it, whether it's a Lockerbie or whether it's the failed Bay of Pigs, in the early 60s, by the United States at the time, and then the tensions that simmered after that. But as he's pointed out, 30,000 troops were responsible for saving Angola from pretty much complete apartheid domination. And they were led by no other person but Raul Castro, who was the brother to Fidel Castro, who succeeded him as president upon his death. Yeah, and so, as controversial as it was, it certainly served to benefit the cause of liberation of the continent, generally. That doesn't mean that everything they're doing is good. Now, if we come back home here, as the president of the Republic of Kenya, President Ruto right now is pretty much the leader of the peace initiatives in the region. And it's always going to be incumbent upon Kenya to take leadership in a lot of these issues. And so even as we discuss here as public intellectuals, I think it's important that those who are tasked with the responsibility of ensuring that this process continue take up initiatives. So when they hear something like that, for instance, a potential skirmish between Rwanda and DRC, there is a movement towards de-escalating that so that it does not actually grow or get out of control. And so I just want to call, on those responsible, especially in this part of from Kenya, to ensure that they assist the president to maintain that kind of leadership that he's now doing, so that we do not start watching from a distance as things unfold. Because in another country is going to start coming in, and guess what? We're going to do what we've been doing, the heavy lifting, then someone else comes to eat our lunch, and that should not be allowed to happen.
All right. I just want to comment briefly on the foreign minister. I think we had Irungu talking about it. That is Sergei Lavrov, who was in Pretoria on Monday for talks with one of Moscow's most important allies in Africa. The visit comes as South Africa prepares for joint naval drills with Russia and China next month. This is Lavrov's second African visit in 6 months. It comes ahead of the Russian-African summit, which last year was postponed to July 2023 due to the war on Ukraine. A South African official who declined to be named because they were not authorized to speak said Lavrov will be visiting Eswatini, Botswana and Angola on his trip. Russia has officially remained silent on its politics with Africa, but as analysts see it, Moscow is relying on private military companies, what we're discussing here, like the Wagner group, to act as door openers, and officially are not incorporated in the strategy at all. But what the analysts see is that they always come first when there is some instability, just as we were talking, and then they help secure those in power who have built relationships with Russia. That is just basically what you're talking about. We just talk about this visit and the July 23 Russia-Africa summit. How will also the world take it? Just as we say, what Nelson Mandela was saying, your enemies are not really necessarily my enemies. So South Africa was the first to really side with Russia or the Ukrainian war, with Cyril Ramaphosa supporting Russia.
Well, the Russians are looking for diplomatic support for their cause in the Ukraine, if you can call it a cause. Debal, things are going to get really bad in Europe. Just as a background, Debal, you know that yesterday the Germans authorized that the Ukrainians be given the Tiger II tanks. It's one of the most advanced tanks in the military today. Leopard, yes. Yes. That's the word, Leopard. Debal, this is an astonishing development. Because if those tanks, Ukraine is a flat country. And that's why in the Second World War, the Germans, Blitzkrieg, was able to reach Stalingrad in like weeks. And it was that same tank, the Leopard tank, which was used in the Second World War, that did those things. And you remember someone once said that history repeats itself twice. The first time as tragedy, and the second time as a farce. I don't want to mention this philosopher because he's not much liked anymore. So, Debal, if this development happens, Debal, what's stopping Russia from bombing those tanks while they're in Poland? If those tanks are going to advance into Ukraine and go and take on the T-72s in Ukraine, if I was a military strategist in Moscow, I would shoot them down before they entered Ukraine to attack my troops. Poland and the other countries, Debal, are members of NATO. And if Poland is attacked, it means that the entire NATO has been attacked. And guess what's the next development after that, Debal? So we're in a very, very, very serious. I heard someone talking about brinkmanship today. I think that's brinkmanship. And it is very urgent that this war, that a third party comes in and intervenes in this war. And I kept on saying that the African Union should have tried and negotiated, and they did. But it seems that the problem is very intractable, and nobody knows how to get out of this war. Now, Lavrov has come to Africa under this context. because something is going to heat up in the Security Council. I remember Kenya. Is Kenya still in the Security Council? Or did we finish our term?
It's gone.
It's finished, right?
It's finished.
Okay, so they want to go to the Security Council, and the plenary is going to vote or abstain on whether or not the actions that are coming in the future. So Mr. Lavrov is preparing the ground for the eventual diplomatic brouhaha, not even a brouhaha, conflict that's coming in the General Assembly. He is also building up international opinion in Africa, because it is seen that Africa is a bit more understanding, if I can use that word, of the Russian issue. Secondly, you see, we have stopped, we told the Ukrainians they're not welcome here. Of course, the president of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, wanted to speak to the Kenya parliament. And our president, I think, correctly said no. And I think that the Europeans, as you know, started a couple of wars over there. About 100 million people died. Today, if they start another one, all bets are off. So I think that it is very urgent that the African Union demands from the United States, Europe, and Russia that the very roots and the very idea of what's called global peace is at stake. And I think we should be very careful to watch what is happening in the next few weeks, because I think that the global trade system is also under threat. We have inflation in Europe. We have inflation all over the world. The supply chain in the world is slowly breaking down because of the training in Ukraine. It is a very dangerous time to live in.
Right, thank you. We want to take a short break right now. And also just to update you on the latest that we have, we can see the pontificate. This is Pope Francis. He, together with the high-power delegation of the heads of the Catholic and Anglican churches, as well as the Church of Scotland, will be traveling to Congo next week in what will be a first of its kind visit centered on politics, human rights, and religion. But basically Africa, not only just Congo. The three leaders, Pope Francis and the Catholic Church, of the Catholic Church, Senior Bishop Justin Welby, the ceremonial head of Worldwide Anglican Commune and retired Reverend, that is Ian Greenshield, who is the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, also will be visiting Congo. And I'll also give you some of the states that they will be visiting aside from Congo as well. But the question they're asking that now this is a moral emergency in DRC Congo. We discuss now the church and politics in DRC. Don't go away.